Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this week's first edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and here's what we have in store for you this evening. Ominous warnings as a new study published today predicts more chaos and violence in South Africa going forward, thanks to ANC elites vying for power and economic opportunities. We speak to the lead author before our panel of analysts weighs in on the implications for the country's future. We also speak to the National Institute of Communicable Diseases hours before the government tells us whether it will lift the national state of disaster or not. The Watchdog starts now. Trouble within the governing party has been responsible for the bulk of the chaos and violence the country has seen over the past dozen or so years. And there's compelling evidence it's going to get worse. Well, at least according to a study published today entitled "The Near Future of South Africa: Protest and Political Stability." Ivor Chipkin is the lead author, and he joins us on the line. Ivor, good evening. Thank you very much for your time. I'm wondering, I mean, you and the co-authors of this study believe that, and I quote, this is an unusual and innovative piece of work. What makes it different from what we've seen or read before?
Vuyo, thank you very much for having me on your show. I think what is innovative about this piece of work is that it is, I think, one of the rare or few pieces of work on political phenomena in South Africa, in the policy space in particular, that is drawn largely or overwhelmingly on data modeling. So it's a quantitative study. And what we've done is that we've reached our conclusions by modeling large quantities of data in the public domain relevant to our study. And if you want, I can take you through it. So I think in South Africa, we have the tendency to, when there is research, it's largely qualitative research. It's often based on selected case studies, and we draw very large-scale conclusions from those studies. Some of it is excellently done, others is not so well done. But nonetheless, I think we don't use the tools of qualitative analysis, and in particular data analytics, which there have been huge strides over the last couple of years, really to supplement or add to our understanding of what is happening in the country. So that's what we've tried to do in the study. Mm-hmm.
And what struck you and your co-authors the most about what came out of the effort?
So I think we found something quite surprising. At least it surprised me, and I think as the report goes into circulation, it's surprising lots of people. So this is a study that came out of a collaboration or a partnership between the Institute for Security Studies and my institute, Government and Public Policy think tank. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to model political protest in South Africa and to see whether there were any interesting patterns emerging. Now, you and your audience, your listeners might be familiar with a body of work that has emerged in South Africa driven largely by South African sociologists. Much of it is outstanding, detailed, theoretically sophisticated work, starting in around 2010, which found that there was, from around 2007, 2008, a huge rise of protest activity in South Africa, a really dramatic escalation of protest activity in South Africa. And what that analysis, they understood it to be, was what Katie Alexander called a rebellion of the poor, and especially useful understanding of what was driving protests. The problem is that that analysis stops around 2012, 2013. We then focused on the period just after the end of that. And what we noticed something very interesting. So there's this huge dramatic rise in protests from about 2004, 2006, 2007. It then stabilizes, and this is the interesting thing. It stabilizes around 2012, 2013. It decreases for a while. Then it increases relatively slowly up until about 2014. And then it stabilizes and even declines until the end of 2017 and beginning of 2018, which coincides with the Ramaphosa administration. And then it rockets. It goes to unprecedented levels. So what we were interested in that period of stabilization. Why did protests in South Africa stabilize between 2013 and the end of 2017, quarter 2018, for that period of 4 or 5 years? Why? So that is what we were trying to understand. And it's in solving that puzzle that I think we've come to understand some quite important things about what drives politics in South Africa. Do you want me to carry on, or do you want to?
Yes, I'm keen to know what you found. In other words, what was responsible for these swings?
So here's the interesting thing. So generally, the analysis that what drives political protest in South Africa and political instability in South Africa is service delivery protests and grievances around unemployment, poverty, socioeconomic issues. And those are undoubtedly huge factors in South Africa. After all, we have especially since 2008, we have an economy in profound crisis. We know that many of our state institutions are in very severe crisis and in decline. We've been through a very long period of what we've come to know as state capture in South Africa, which is associated with the weakening of state institutions. So the paradox is that during that very acute period of decline, economic and institutional, that's the period when protest activity seems to be at its lowest. So what we started to wonder was whether it's true then that protests are really driven by grievances around service delivery and socioeconomic issues. So we modeled, we had access to several databases and we built some databases. We modeled protest activity against questions of unemployment, against a measure of service delivery in municipalities and several other indexes as well. And we found, funnily enough, that the correlations were very, very low. In other words, we found that it did not seem to be the case that protest activity in South Africa was fundamentally driven or caused by those issues. In 2010, Richard Pithouse and a group of scholars under the leadership of Carl van Holt, or working with Carl van Holt, suggested that many of the service delivery protests in South Africa were in fact protests driven were in fact animated by contestation between ANC elites at local level and perhaps at a provincial level as well. So we wanted to test that hypothesis. Was it the case actually that service delivery protests were largely driven by contestation within the African National Congress? So that's what we did. We tested whether protests protests correlated with events in the African National Congress. We built a very large ANC database of ANC events. There are certain limitations to that database which we can discuss if you want, but on the whole, I'm quite confident that it's a very rigorous database. And we correlated statistically whether there were correlations between the ANC events and the protest data. And what we found, which was quite surprising, was that there was a high correlation, or a higher correlation than there was between service delivery and the socioeconomic issues. And what it suggests very strongly, therefore, is that internal contestation within the ANC is a profound driver of general protest in South Africa. Which begs the question then, so why is there this period of stability? Well, if it's true that contestation within the ANC is the largest driver of political stability generally, then we think that what happens during the period of Jacob Zuma's administration is that measures are taken to bring down or to better manage internal ANC contestation. So let's remember that the context of the Jacob Zuma period. It's a period of tremendous state capture, enormous rent-seeking, huge patronage. We think that patronage is not only going for personal self-enrichment, it's also being used to feed into ANC processes. And essentially, that patronage is effectively being used to buy off the conflict or the tension within the African National Congress. So that's the one. Patronage is being used to manage conflict or contestation within the ANC. We also find, which is very, very disturbing, we find during that period there's a tremendous rise in political violence, especially assassinations. So we think, again, this data is the least robust in our analysis. So we are very, very tentative in this regard. But we do think that there's enough evidence to suggest that assassinations and political repression or political and violent intimidation is also being used to manage elite contestation within the African National Congress. And we think it's the combination of patronage and repression during the period from 2013 to the end of 2017 that largely explains why, in the midst of a political and economic crisis in South Africa, political protest in South Africa comes down. Which then raises the question of why it goes through the roof with the rise of Cyril Ramaphosa. And we think the reason lies in the fact that Ramaphosa has fewer resources to manage elite contestation in the ANC than Jacob Zuma did. We think, for example, that we doubt that we don't think that the Ramaphosa is likely to resort to violence or the use of violence, and we also don't think that his model of good governance is likely to reuse the resources of corruption and rent seeking as a way of managing that contestation as well. And as a result, what we're seeing during the Ramaphosa period is an intensification of elite contestation within the ANC, and it effectively becoming unmanaged and unmanageable, which is what we see ultimately in the events of July 2021, which you can call a revolt, an insurrection, whatever language we use, but a dramatic burst of extraordinary and almost unprecedented violence in the country.
You then go further to say that with the ANC steadily losing support, things are going to get worse. How do you arrive at that conclusion? Well,
it's not quite the conclusion we reach to. There are a couple of scenarios which we point to. What it does is it asks some very, very difficult questions about South Africa's future. It asks the question about elite contestation. I think is a given. South Africa is a very complex society. Elite contestation it's not a question of whether it's good or bad. It simply is a fact. It's severe. It's acute in South Africa. So the question that arises in South Africa is how do we manage elite contestation in South Africa within the framework of South Africa's democracy? The answer the ANC provided right from 1994 was to absorb that contestation within the African National Congress itself and try to contain it within the party. It worked. It served South Africa broadly fairly well until around 2007, when I think it tears the ANC apart in the famous conference of 2007 and events after that. So one model of managing that elite contestation we think is an authoritarian model, which we saw under Jacob Zuma. The other models are a little bit more optimistic, potentially, that various elites within the ANC break off from the ANC because they cannot get what they want through the ANC anymore, and they form other political parties. Not so strange. We've seen this with COPE, we've seen this with the UDM, we've seen this with the EFF, and what that does is that it keeps elite contestation within the broad framework of South Africa's democracy. So again, a possibility of consolidating South Africa's democracy within that framework. But there are other darker scenarios as well, ones which I think there's quite strong evidence of, and that is of some elites giving up on the political space altogether and pursuing their interests through, quite frankly, criminal and violent means, becoming a warlordism in effect. And I think that kind of phenomena we are beginning to see, or have seen for a long time, in some parts of the country, like in KwaZulu-Natal. I suspect it's going to be a combination of these various scenarios. But what it does suggest, though, that for those political pundits who only see South Africa's future in terms of political party percentages, I think they're missing out on a very substantial domain of South African politics, which we need to better understand, and that is the domain of parliamentary politics, and also that kind of politics which happens outside of the formal political space. And that, for me, is the big one to watch.
Okay, let's bring into the conversation pundits who, Asanda Ngwasheng did dabble a bit in this content that you've finally released today. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana has also been watching these developments with a keen interest. In other words, he didn't come into it for the very first time today. Good evening to both of you, and thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I'm going to start with you, Asanda, if I may, as someone who has somewhat been privy to this content that some of us are seeing for the very first time today. Just your thoughts.
I think that it's very interesting work, and it makes very interesting conclusions. So for me, I think that as political analysts, as people who watch politics in South Africa, we've been saying for quite a long time that there is a link between some of the protests that we're seeing, some of the political killings and the various contestations within South Africa, and there is a link to that in the ANC and the contestations within the ANC. So I think the report gives us very interesting background to what those could be. But I think the one thing I would say for me is missing is kind of, or not missing really, but I just worry that we don't want to get to a point where we just connect, protests to ANC contestations and we leave it at that. I think it is a situation where ANC elites are using the very valid questions, the very valid concerns that citizens have for their own nefarious means. So it's not to say that there aren't complaints or that there isn't dissent, but rather that dissent is then driven towards very specific means and very specific agendas. So there is conflict, and there is a dire, lack of trust in the system, and there is a consistent call for change in the political system, for change in the political leadership by people, and then various people then join that and become opportunists and drive the point to whichever means they wanted to. And we've seen this, I think, with July, where it started off with Jacob Zuma being threatened with jail or refusing to go to jail, essentially, and then it ended up being a kind of almost national uprising by the poor and people who were already hungry and already frustrated with COVID lockdowns and the impact on them in terms of losing jobs, in terms of rising hunger. So I applaud the report, and I think it gives us interesting insights, but I want to re-emphasize that there is dissent. It's just that the ANC is using it towards its means. It's not to say that there isn't dissent and there isn't dissatisfaction.
Professor Ndletyana, your take?
Hi, good evening. An important study by Ivo and his colleagues. Of course, I have a few details that I might agree or add, but I think the study overall contributes to a growing body of work that has been there really perhaps for the last 4 or 5 years, looking at how the various ANC elites, as Ivo has said, have resorted to violence to settle scores within. I've done a bit of work, for instance, in PE over this. Chippy Olva has done some work over this. So it's something that some of us who have focused quite largely on local politics, doing case studies, which gives you a much broader sense of where these things start and how they pan out, and if at all they are ever resolved. So there has been some attention. I was right to the extent that it hasn't been widespread. It's a field of study. I'm afraid in the last 10 years or so, scholars haven't touched on by and large, but there used to be a lot of work on this during pre-1994. So for me, it is shedding light on a very important subject that some of us have started studying in the last few years or so. One or two things, though, that I might disagree with here and there. For instance, if you look at what appears to be stability under JZ within the ANC between 2013 and 2017. Yes, perhaps patronage had something to do with it because JZ allowed really local elites to indulge, to feed off state resources. But at the same time, two things happened in the ANC, especially after 2007, especially 2009. One was that a lot of people who disagree with JZ, who lost out at Polokwane, left the party to join COPE. And so, you didn't have contrarian voices. You had JZ folks pretty much in charge. So there was no one to contest office against the other. And secondly, even if you disagreed, you wanted to fight it out, you couldn't really because there was no recourse. It was a JZ ANC out and out. So a lot of people were driven out. Those who remained are people of like-minded who shared in the spoils of Polokwane. And part of the reason then they've come back, and this is the point I think the study misses dramatically. Part of the reason why they've come back and employed violence since 2017-18 is because of the enormity, the depth of corruption that they've committed under JZ. Remember, with Cyril coming in, there's more emphasis on institutions working, getting people arrested, prosecutions. So the stakes are quite high. People are becoming quite desperate. And so they then try, part of what they've been doing really is to discredit Cyril's regime with the hope that doing so would derail prosecutions. So the surge of violence, it's not so much because Cyril doesn't have patronage to spread around to pacify these folks. It is precisely because of the depth of corruption, law enforcement, the threat that is facing these folks, jail time that they're...
Okay, we seem to have a problem. Okay. Ivo, I don't know if you want to come in on what both Asanda and Professor Ntlekana have just said.
No, I think they've made outstanding points. Mabisi's work has long been an inspiration to me. So, and he and I have been colleagues and have been in conversation over a long period of time. And his work is very key and is always is one of the key inspirations for this piece of work. Ayanda's comments are absolutely fundamental, and we've had to tread a very careful line in the course of preparing the study. There's been quite a lot of debate and a vigorous debate within the team and between ISS and GAP around what is precisely this relationship between ANC contestation driving conflict, driving debates, and the genuine grievances around service delivery and unemployment, etc. So the way in which I increasingly think about it is that those protests, what happens to them is that they get absorbed into the African National Congress. So it's not that they are simply engineered by ANC politicians or ANC political entrepreneurs for their own purposes. But that these are, we're genuine crisis in South Africa for facing overwhelming majority of people. That these are real protests which get absorbed then into the terms of the African National Congress in the way in which the ANC served almost to absorb many of the contradictions and tensions of South African society into its own body. Had it been able to pull it off and manage those internal contradictions through its own systems and processes, it would have provided a long period of stability. But in the end, it couldn't do it. And this, in the end, I think, is the background to the phenomenon of 2007. And SABC makes absolutely valid point. I mean, I think he's absolutely right. It's one of the things which we don't consider adequately in the report is the degree to is the internal machinations of the ANC, and in particular the way in which opposition to Jacob Zuma effectively either is expelled or expels itself from the African National Congress during that key period. So I think it's a very useful insight there. Let me just emphasize that the study, though, I think the originality of the study and the value of the study is, I think we've probably got a lot of things wrong. But I think the general study is that what we've done is we've offered on the basis of data modeling, we've shown that there's data which is of value in the public domain. There's lots of it. And that if we ask that data the right kinds of questions with the right kind of modeling, we can develop hypotheses which are more expansive and which are more which are broader than those offered by quite local studies. So I think the combination between the two of these very detailed, almost ethnographic studies on the one hand, with this broader quantitative analysis which we've been doing in this kind of work, I think that's the way forward.
Asana, I know you're not a big fan of scenarios, but the claim or the conclusion that Ivor and them arrive at, that and I quote, elite contestation is likely to become more violent as the cake shrinks, that should worry everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been on record in many platforms on this one and many saying that, right now the biggest threat to South Africa's democracy is actually the ANC, because the contestations have gotten to a point where they don't care about the country, they don't care about state institutions, and they don't care about the preservation of the basic tenets of our democracy. It is about making sure that they and specific people are in power and that they are able to access power and they are able to kind of do what they want to do with the power that they then get. And I think, I want to add to what Prof said as well around this issue of the protest and the patronage lines. You must remember that one of the changes that have happened is that the ANC has increasingly over time lost support and lost numbers. And what that means is that it translates to less seats in Gauteng. It translates to less seats in local government areas, which means you have less kind of jobs to give to people. And so the patronage lines themselves institutionally have shrunk. So it's not, I don't think so much that Cyril doesn't have the power or the money, but it's more that in terms of government capacity, there isn't the kind of capacity that, for instance, when Jacob Zuma entered government, that there were. And I think this is one of the things that's making, over and above the threat of being jailed, this is one of the things that's making people quite desperate. I was in Gauteng at some stage very soon after the ANC first lost Johannesburg, and it was a bloodbath. There were people who basically had to pack their bags and go home because essentially their entire livelihoods were based on being ANC cadres and having connections to the city of Joburg. And as soon as those taps dried, they were literally stuck, without a paddle in the middle of the sea. And we saw the same thing and continue to see the same thing as the pie shrinks at national, as the pie shrinks, in terms of local governance, that even the ANC itself has now gotten to a very dangerous state of subverting democracy to a point where people in Buffalo City, we're looking at a case right now in Buffalo City, where people voted for X person, a second person was kind of second in line. The ANC is somewhere in the middle between the people putting in the name and the names actually landing up at Luthuli House. There was a shift. And so people who were not voted as number one ended up as number one on the list, and people who were voted as number one ended up as number two. And there was a whole commission, the Kgalema Motlanthe Commission, which has said that, you're looking at about 23 plus wards, that's ward councillors as well as PR seats that are going to have to be reversed because the wrong people are in power. Now that is very dangerous, because if we call ourselves a democracy and a democracy for the people, by the people, you cannot allow a situation where people in power in a political party have the capacity and the capability to shift names to a point where more than 20 people are not representatives of the communities that they come from, but they are rather the preferred people of whatever faction was in power and was actually sending the forms. And I think that is a dangerous thing, even more dangerous than what happens at the polls, because one of the basic tenets of democracy is for the people, by the people. And if you can't choose the local person who's going to represent you, then how much more at a national level? We know already that at a national level, the constituency model isn't working. And we know that at a provincial level, people use the positions at provincial level to amass power, and then as soon as they're promoted to national, they then fight with the provincial person who's left behind, trying to take that seat to make sure that they're kind of holding this thing where they're still at provincial and still at national. We know Ace Mahashula, for example, he was the SG at national, but he was still fighting for his position in the Free State. And we're seeing this resurgence of him trying to yank back power in the Free State in this latest run-up to the conference. And so even the way in which the ANC political system of contestation is built is highly problematic, particularly when you add something like you get a job in, as an ANC cadre in the government and you have to tithe like it's a church. And these are the things that lead and contribute to the current levels of corruption that we're seeing. Because if I know that I'm going to earn 1.5 million, but a good 5 of that 1.5 million is going to the ANC, then of course I'm going to look for a different source of income to make sure that happens, because I'm coming from a family where, there are 10 people waiting in line because our family member has finally made it into government. And this is the system that we need to understand and not be in denial about. And we need to also explore. I always say things like black tax and the impact of black tax in people's ability to not be corrupt, because that is part of what's happening. People are putting in friends and family because the economic structure that we have is not absorbing enough people at a fast enough rate. And so I have access to power and I put in my people, and kind of you end up with nepotism, you end up with corruption and all kinds of things. And so there's a lot of kind of other structural issues that continue to be problematic within the ANC and within the government structure and within our economy, which all add and lead to this incessant need for a Petronet line that is never ending and that never gets satisfied. Because quite frankly, it doesn't matter if you give these guys 500 million or 5 billion, they'll eat it all just the same and they'll still need more.
Prof, I mean, if past experience is anything to go by, I mean, the ANC will be indifferent to this report, as has been the case with the others. People like you, people like Stephen Friedman, and a lot of other people have actually done. Or let me exploit here for a second the fact that you often do sort of get to be in closed session with some of them, and of course voice your views and opinions. Is that a fair thing to say? That, I mean, if past experience is anything to go by, they'll be indifferent?
I think they've started doing something. For instance, you have a few reforms happening now. You have new disciplinary committees or appeals committees that are about to be set up. And they are going to be manned by independent people taken out of the NEC. These are people who have no interest really in NEC business as such. What you've had in the past is that NEC members have had conflict of interest. And so they would have their allies, for instance, cases coming to the NEC from the Integrity Commission, and they wouldn't rule on them, and they would come up with all sorts of excuses. So there was a lot of partisanship. And now you have an independent group of people coming in. So you are likely to have a fairer and quicker resolution, I think, of disputes. So there's some commitment. But I do want to touch on two things. It will be difficult to reform the ANC because the ANC has degenerated into a collection of individual strong men, perhaps women as well, in a number of areas. So you no longer have collective leadership, for instance. So you have one guy, most of the time this is the person with money, who then is able to recruit quite a number of members, say in a region. And these members are just going along because they are paid. So people work for the ANC, they get paid. So it's not about values, it's not about what the ANC stands for. So these are strong men around whom the organization is built. These are local barons, right? They control the region. Some of them are regional chairpersons who've never worked anywhere in their lives, but have huge houses and everything else, and they mobilize support for the province. The province in turn is a strong man, and that strong man provides support. He pays homage to the president, and that used to be the case certainly under JZ. So, and at some point, violence comes into the picture where perhaps the strong man who thinks that he's justified, he's entitled to being in charge, his authority gets challenged, and the challenger is not persuaded by money. And so the strong man then resorts to violence. So the ANC, they don't resort occasionally to the use of violence. The underworld is now part of the ANC. Because the strong men have grown so entitled to being in power, they can't imagine themselves being dislodged. So you need then to remove the strong men who've propped up the organization. And part of doing that, Vuyo, is to, because a lot of them have committed crime, get the law enforcement working. And this is where I think Ivo is partly right, that you are likely to have more and more violence coming up because they are going to resist imprisonment. They have been implicated, quite a number of them, in state capture. And you would have had even more had the Zondo Commission investigated local government, because that's where most of the rot lies. So you are going to have a lot of violence coming up. Yes, this has to do with livelihoods. Most, for instance, ANC councillors, probably about 85 of them, 85% don't have post-matric, and even roughly the same number have matric, right? Don't have matric, rather. So you have a lot of people without papers, really, to get jobs side of it. So membership of the ANC for them is critical to their own livelihood. And they are willing, therefore, to kill to secure that membership. And where you have in local communities the private sector shrinking, the fewer jobs that are there disappearing, it means that more and more of them are focusing their attention toward the state. The queue gets longer, then they'll take out the guns to shorten the queue so that they are ahead of the queue. So you are going to have a lot of this. That is why state institutions need to be quite diligent and forceful in dealing with this.
And Ivo, that's what Prof has ended on now is what you are raising with your colleagues. Take us through very briefly the recommendations that you are making.
SABC's ended is that's in large part the sort of the argument of the report and why we think that things are going to become more intense and more conflictual going forward. Just one point which I think is an important one, and it might be an area of disagreement between the professor and myself, and that is the degree to which the ANC is already drawn on organised crime and criminal networks. if it was the case, then South Africa would be in a situation very close to many places in Eastern Europe, Russia, certainly the Balkans, Ukraine. We'd be in a very similar situation where you have a very, very high interpenetration between organized crime and political and politics. I'm not sure South Africa is there yet. So I think some parts of South Africa may well be. KZN might be quite advanced in that area. Other regions might be. Eastern Cape might be in pockets as well. But generally speaking, I'm not convinced that kind of interpenetration of political groupings and organized crime is there yet, and that gives us some space to maneuver. But I do agree with Professor China that this is something absolutely key to watch out for, and it's one of the areas which I really think we, as academics, as scholars, as civil society, as broadly South African citizens, this is something which we need to watch out for and mobilize very strongly against. I think in terms of the recommendations, I think there's a lot more work that's needed. I think this kind of quantitative work is required. I think we have to solve, I think, a very troubling or difficult puzzle in South Africa. I think if Professor Ndletjana is correct and Asanda correct, which I think they are correct, and it's what our report goes a long way to suggest, to agree with them, that this kind of contestation at all different levels of the state are given and are likely to increase as the economy gets smaller, the opportunities in the private sector decline, as state resources decline, this intensification of this conflict. I think the big question going forward, and it's not so much a recommendation, it's more a question because I don't know the answer, and I haven't seen a good answer to this question anywhere, is how does one contain this conflict that is coming or that we're already in within the broad framework of South Africa's democracy? And I think it goes back to the question of where South Africa is along the road of transition. And I think we're very much in the phase of democratic consolidation. So there was a whole body of research in the 1990s which celebrated 1994 almost spontaneously as a moment of democratic consolidation. I don't agree with that. I think we're entering that period now where the democratic project is at its greatest risk, because it's not a question of goodies and baddies, Democrats versus non-Democrats. I think there are fundamental structural issues which can either be resolved democratically, and how we resolve them democratically, that's the big question, or they can be resolved through more authoritarian measures, of which the experiences around the world, there are many. So how do we resolve the current contradictions which we've been discussing tonight within the framework of democracy? That, for me, is the biggest question of the day.
Asanda, how do we avoid the situation getting uglier and deadlier?
I think that there's a very simple answer to that, which is that we need South Africans to go out in their numbers and vote for independent people who they believe have the power and the interest in their needs, rather than to continue to feed this beast that is the ANC, which I agree with the Prof that it actually, the ANC is at a point where it has very heavy links, which have been, written about in media, to organized crime. And I think also we can't look at organized crime kind of in this big criminal mafioso enterprise only. We need to recognize, the big men, as you was talking about. I don't know if you remember in the pre-2008 era, there was the 2007 era, there was this talk of the Super Premier League. And those are big men who were known to do whatever it took to continue to be in power and to make sure that the outcome of 2007 was the outcome that they wanted. And in fact, there was a threat of that happening again at the last elections. It's just that David Mabuza kind of plot twisted everybody and led to a different outcome. And I think that I've been saying, and I'm going to say it again, Vuyo, that we need to start thinking about a South Africa without the ANC and what that looks like for our own sakes and for the sake of our democracy. And we need to start rethinking our reliance on political parties in general, because I don't think, I say the ANC needs to go and people need to think beyond the ANC, but I don't think the DA is ready to govern either. If you look at what it's done in the Western Cape and the ways it still continues to kind of racially profile people and kind of create this apartheid style governance of people in the same province as two countries. And I think that, a lot of the new political parties have some potential because they, some of them are fresh. But I think a lot of the people in our political system are actually very much compromised because, as has been, as has been spoken about, they don't have other options. And a person without options is very dangerous because they have nothing to lose, right? And so if I have nothing to lose, then there's nothing stopping me from making sure that the destruction of South Africa becomes a reality, because I'm going to be, in a bad position either way. If I lose my ANC membership and my ANC position, I'm going to go back to the unemployment line, and I'm going to be laughed at by my community, and I'm going to go back to being, the invisible people of South Africa, who are mostly poor and unemployed. And so there's a sense in which we are dealing with people who not only do they not have a vested interest in the future of South Africa beyond their own kind of continuing to access power and money, they also have nothing to lose. And that is also a function of the ways in which the ANC has failed itself to create an economy that can kind of help and absorb everybody. Because if the ANC had created an economy that had a space for people who have and those who don't have matric, we wouldn't be sitting with a situation where the new channel for people who don't have matric or who only have matric is now political. And of course, if you're unemployed, you have all the time in the world for those hundreds of branch meetings. You have all the time in the world to gather people up and make, a career politically, because everybody else is actually at work and busy. And so that's how we end up being a country with all these people, with all these careers and all this education being governed by people who, they couldn't pass maths in the same class when they were still at school. Okay. And we kind of wonder to ourselves, how is it that we're a country that has such high potential, that is globally renowned, but the quality of leadership that we have leaves a lot to be desired, because the people who have the capacity and capability to lead this country are busy doing other things, while those who have no options are busy plotting and planning political careers. And we need to change that. And we need to create an economy that can absorb everybody so that people have multiple channels to access success, and that we don't end up with this kind of long line to success that, as a prof has very, very beautifully articulated, can be very quickly shortened with an okapi or a gun.
Okay. Quick last word from you, Prof.
Well, we can change these things, Vuyo, if we introduce new practices, and those new practices become routine. We then generate a new culture. I think we need to let ANC people, ANC cadre know that there are other opportunities out there outside of politics. School is very important. I think for quite some time now, we allow them to associate political office with patronage. Even SASCO, for instance, you have SRC people who fail year in, year in, but they stay at university because they chow SRC money, right? So that culture of public office with patronage gets built there, and they leave university without even any qualification because they know that they are guaranteed of a job somewhere because they carry an ANC membership. So if we professionalize the civil service, we clean out all the bad elements, initiate new practices, make them routine. And with that routine, then you have the emergence of a new culture. New culture leads to a new behavior. That's where we need to go. It's not too late.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave. Special thanks to all of you, Professor SABC Ndletyana and Asanda Ngwasheng, our panelists for this evening, as well as Ivor Chipkin, who is the lead author of this report that was published today. To this now, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs says South Africans will know by midnight if the national state of disaster will be lifted or extended by another 30 days. This says South Africans wait with bated breath to hear if government will lift the national state of disaster and its restrictive regulations. President Cyril Ramaphosa has hinted at government lifting the state of disaster.
The outbreak of the coronavirus on South African shores in 2020 was declared a national disaster. This forced the authorities to find ways to curb the spread of the pandemic. One of those was to invoke the Disaster Management Act. The Act empowers the executive to declare a national state of disaster and publish regulations aimed at containing the pandemic. At first, this was welcomed across the political divide as South Africans rallied behind government in the fight against the coronavirus, which was claiming an increasing number of lives, while hospitals were overflowing with COVID-19 patients. However, as the time went by, support for government's handling of the pandemic appeared to be waning. Some opposition parties called for lockdown regulations to be relaxed or lifted.
It remains critical that what is left of the heavy-handed response to the pandemic is abolished, so that jobs and our economy can start to make a full recovery. The state of disaster must end, and it must end right away.
The Freedom Front Plus submitted a private member's bill to amend the Disaster Management Act to ensure that Parliament plays a role in deciding whether or not a national state of disaster should be declared and for how long. But the FF Plus's bill was shot down.
They voted against this private member's bill, and therefore it is proof that the government is misusing its political position for power and just extend as they wish. The Freedom Front Plus will look at other ways to see that we curb these powers of the executive, because it's no sense in further extending the state of disaster.
However, the bill is expected to be tabled and debated in the National Assembly soon. It's unclear whether it will sail through the National Assembly stage. Lula Mamatya, SABC News, Parliament.
Well, that's how politicians see it. What do scientists think? Well, Professor Michelle Groom is the head of Public Health Surveillance and Response Division at the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. Good evening, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. Of course, we know for a fact that the decision lies somewhere else. But what do the facts say? In other words, given where we are with the a pandemic at the moment, what would be the pros and cons of either decision?
Yeah, so good evening and to you and your viewers. So I think we really have been seeing a decrease over the last kind of 6 weeks or so in terms of the number of cases that we've seen, as well as the percent positivity. So those rates are coming down, the number of tests that have been occurring, as well as our hospitalizations and deaths. And this is really in the face of, the lowest restrictions that we've had since the start of the pandemic. And I think we went into the fourth wave with quite a high level of population immunity. I mean, our vaccination rates were not as high as they could have been, but we did have a combination of both protection from infection as well as from vaccination. And so we really did see a large number of cases during the fourth wave, but we really didn't see the same level of hospitalizations and deaths that we'd seen with previous waves. And what we've seen, we've been quite slow coming off this fourth wave, so maybe the cases and the percent positivity hasn't decreased as quickly as we've seen with other waves. But I think really this is in the face of, a lot more interaction between people. This last little we've seen some increases in cases over those last couple of weeks, which has been mainly in the under 20-year-olds. And this we saw really was, with the back to school, we saw schools returning to full capacity. And during that time, we had kind of slightly increased number of cases amongst the under 20s, but that has also gone down over the last couple of weeks. So I think we're slowly returning to kind of those levels that we see between waves, and our hospitalizations and deaths are really returning to very low levels again. So I think even before the third wave, we had high level of population immunity. During Omicron, I think many people were exposed either for the first time or exposed again to COVID-19. And I think we really have got a very high underlying population immunity going into kind of a fifth wave, which we do expect at some point.
Given everything you've just said in the context you've given us, what would be arguments for or against ending or lifting the national state of disaster?
Yeah. So I think a lot of these kind of like the mask wearing, for example, has been mandated. I mean, public have to wear masks outside, when they're in the public. And I guess, when we do away with some of those regulations, it will be left more up to individuals to make these decisions rather than it being mandated. But I think we're 2 years into the pandemic. And I think we know who our vulnerable populations are. We know a lot more about COVID than we did right at the start. So we know what situations are going to be times when there's going to be more transmission. So we know indoors, your chance of transmission and your risk of getting COVID is going to be higher. So perhaps, things like indoor wearing masks indoors when you've got very close contact with other.
Oh, okay. I don't know what has happened to that line. Professor Michelle Groom, who is the head of Public Health Surveillance and Response Division at the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. We've lost that line, but that's where we're going to leave it. What a pity, because there's one or two things I still wanted to ask. But that's our show for this evening. On a sad note, where technology failed us. But do join us again tomorrow evening for another episode of The Watchdog. From me and the rest of the team, it's a good night.